Welcome to the Semenzin Institute and to the second SETI, or third SETI workshop actually hosted by the Semenzin Institute. The first one was on video during COVID. As you see with my mask, we never know. So anyway, most of you have been here before, but for those who haven't, the Semenzin Institute is the world leading venue for collaborative research in theoretical computer science and adjoining fields. And our mandate is really to encourage collaboration and to invite programs that where theory computation can contribute, but we've been very outgoing. So like last week, we had a neuroscience and an AI workshop, and in fact, the semester that just ended, and we're interested in many topics, including a whale communication and in general use of AI for many technologies and many applications. So just a little bit of administrivia. You're not supposed to bring food and drinks here, and we kind of take it seriously because, you know, we're grown-ups, but we spill things all the time. So please don't do that. And I'm really excited to welcome SETI here because, you know, it's dear to my heart. And now I'm going to give the mic to David Gruber, who's our fearless leader here. And he'll say a few words about SETI, I think, and welcome you.
Sure. Oh, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shafi, and thank you for welcoming us here to Simon's and welcome you all. We're really excited for, as Shafi said, this is our third installment of Decoding Communication in Non-Human Species. And when we first started this was a little bit of a crazy idea. And now you could see that the field is kind of moving along and becoming more mainstream. So really also welcoming our colleagues from Interspecies Internet, which are one of the real primary conveners of the field too, and the many people that are intersecting with SETI in various ways. It was also last year that some of the findings from this workshop, such as elephants having names, and led to some of the other discoveries that have happened in the year. So we're really happy to just kind of create this catalytic energy of people coming together and thinking about how advances in machine learning could be used to understand the non-human world. So series of talks over the week, and yeah, just thank everyone. I think some of the best things happen here is just like among the community and among the discussions. So feel free to keep talking. And with that, we're starting off with our first one with Chiara on whistle variability and social acoustic interactions and bottlenose. But also, and one thing, also wanted to thank our partner in this, Oceankind, for their generosity and support in supporting this meeting. So thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, David. Is the microphone working? Yeah, perfect. Hello. Okay, so hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to start off this workshop. Today, I'm going to talk to you about dolphins and the project that I'm doing on dolphin communication. And I want to start by just getting us all to think about why on earth do we care about dolphins, maybe running the risk of being a bit rhetorical and redundant in a workshop where we work on animal communication. I want to say that in the first place, we're interested about dolphins in terms of their biology and behavior and how understanding their communication can really help us towards conservation efforts and in general, understanding a little bit more about the species that we share the planet with. But on the other hand, we also care about drawing insights into animal communication more in general. So studying dolphin communication can allow us to draw, for example, analogies or homologies, and in general, make comparison with other species and learn a little bit about how language evolved in the first place. And when we learn about language evolution, we cannot not talk about our own language. So human language, which has traditionally been thought as the defining unique feature of human language. But I like to wonder if that is really the case. And if that is really the case, how close can we come to it in the animal world? So to learn something about dolphins means to ultimately learn something about ourselves as well. And here's a little bit of an outline of this talk. So I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of an introduction about dolphin cognition abilities and their society, so the way their society is structured. Then I'm going to talk about our own data, how we collect it, and why it's special. And then I'm going to move on to the analysis, two analyses. One is about variability in whistles, and the second is more focused on the dolphins' social structure and how it relates to their communication system, and a little bit about the future work that this project is going to be seeing. So let's start with dolphin cognition. So dolphins are really smart. And there is an indirect measure of intelligence in the animal world that is a surface to volume ratio. And dolphins have a very high one. So that means their brain is not only very large compared to their body, but their cortex is also very, very complicated, very folded. So we imagine that there's a lot going on. They have a lot of brain power. And we see that also observing their behavioral skill set, which make dolphins ultimately a very interesting model for studying both communication and cognition. And finally, the social structure that they live in is a fission-fusion society. So let me explain a little bit more about what that means. So a fission-fusion society is a society in which individuals associate, but also separate in a very dynamic way during the day and during their lifespan. So they will merge and split based on the needs of their day. So some of the behaviors that we can observe in dolphins include mating, playing, play fighting, and foraging. So I will give you a specific example of what I mean by sophisticated behavior. Let's take foraging, for example. In these images here, you see a very particular strategy that the dolphins use in their foraging behavior, which is called a mud net. So the dolphin will go on and identify where the fish are. And then in a pod, so in a group of dolphins, they will start swimming around and moving the mud, so the sand at the very bottom of the water, creating a condition of lack of visibility for the fish. So as soon as the fish are trapped in this mud of in this ring of mud, they will start jumping out, trying to escape the mud, and the dolphins are waiting right there for the fish to come directly in their mouth. So obviously this is a behavior that is quite sophisticated and requires both planning and coordination between the members of the pod. Another example, very quickly, is that dolphins have been shown to be able to use tools. So an example is sponging. So dolphins will actually put a sponge at the bottom of their beak to try and dive for and look for fish at the very bottom of the sea and to avoid getting injured. So this is a very clear example of tool use. And another interesting thing about this is that it's culturally transmitted. So what you see here is that the dolphins that are spongers, so able to use these tools in red, have been shown to mainly associate with other dolphins that are spongers. And they will teach each other this technique and kind of pass it down culturally. So, but we're interested in communication, right? So the first question that I want to ask is, how does communication play a role into this social structure maintenance? So let's go on and try to answer this question with some data. And I want to talk to you about why our data is a bit different than everything that has been done so far traditionally in dolphin studies. So the main limitations of dolphin literature at the moment is that the data is either collected in captivity, so where dolphins are in pool and they do not behave naturally, especially when it comes to social behavior, or they are collected in the wild, where it's really hard to follow the same individuals over long periods of time. I mean, you're all familiar with this problem. And what we propose here is a setup of semi-captivity. So at the Dolphin Reef in Eilat, Israel, the dolphins are actually free to swim around in the Red Sea. They are completely free, but they do tend to spend most of the day close to the shore, where they are not only fed a few times a day, but they're also able to hunt. Like they're not fed in a way that would prevent them from surviving if they stop getting that fish. But they have also developed a relationship with the trainers that are over there. And so this allows us to passively monitor them. And specifically, we have a setup that consists of 3 hydrophones that we put underwater, the H's that you see there. And when the dolphins swim around this area, which is, again, most of the time during most of the day, we are able to passively get acoustic information. And since recently, we also have installed 4 cameras. So 3 of them allow us to have a 360 degrees view. And one over here covers most of the remaining vision field. And we've been gathering data since 2018 every day, but a bit more on that later. First, I want to finish the introduction by also making you listen to what kind of sounds we're recording thanks to this setup. And the tests that we ran were not successful, so I will just try to play the sounds and make you listen to them right here. So the first type of sound is not a strictly communication sound. It's echolocation clicks that they use to navigate underwater. So they will produce the clicks, hear the sound bouncing back, and navigate in low visibility conditions thanks to these clicks. What you see here is the sounds plotted on a spectrogram. So on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have frequencies. And clicks sound like this. Hopefully you can hear that. So when these clicks, which are broadband frequency clicks, are produced very close to each other, they stop being echolocation clicks and they become burst pulse sounds. Now, burst pulse sounds are very understudied, but they have been correlated with the states of emotional duress. So when they're fighting or even mating, so states of high emotions, let's say. And they sound like this. But what most of the literature has been focusing on is actually whistles. So whistles are the last sound that you see here. And it's one frequency that is modulated over time. It sounds just like a whistle, but it's a very, very high frequency. So hopefully you'll be able to hear that. And they are the most interesting. I'll tell you why in a second. First, let's hear it. So you have 2 categories of whistles. So we start with the one that we know, which is signature whistles. And the second category, spoiler, is non-signature whistle, which is everything that we don't know what it is. But signature whistles themselves are very interesting because you can think of them as names for dolphins. So they're defined as an individually distinctive whistle that is learned. And it represents most of the dolphins' repertoire. So a dolphin will mainly produce their own signature whistle. So that's about 90% of the time in captivity and 50 to 70% of the time in the wild. It's important to notice that a dolphin will produce their own signature whistle, for example, to announce themselves, to broadcast their identity, but other dolphins can produce other dolphin signature whistles as well. So we know the dolphins at the dolphin reef, so let's meet them. And by we know them, we know their we know their signature whistle, and we know a little bit about their social structure and their story as well. So we have 5 dolphins, 4 females, and Neo, who is the only male. We know that Luna and Neo are siblings, and they are the leaders of the pod. Now, if you bear with me, I will show you how we ended up labeling them as the leaders of the pod based on the data that we analyzed. But they're siblings, and Nana and Nikita are sisters. And then we have Josefa, who is a spotted dolphin, so not a bottlenose dolphin, that joined the pod for a brief amount of time in 2019. and try to integrate herself in the pod. So we have data from her as well. And as you can see, we already, thanks to previous research, we already have their signature whistle. So we know which one corresponds to who. What we did with all this data that we extracted, that we recorded, sorry, we wanted to get out the relevant data, so the dolphin sounds. And what we did is we selected a subset of data from 2019, so when Josefa was also present, and we developed an algorithm that is energy-based to extract whistle contours. So bear in mind that for the following analysis, we're mainly going to focus on the frequency of the whistle. So we're going to discard the rest of the spectrum information. And for a total of 250 hours of recordings, we were able to extract 8,566 whistles. So thanks to this method, not only we get the frequency contour, but since we know what the signature whistles of every dolphin looks like, we are also able to categorize them. So for example, here are 3 examples of the signature whistle of Neo. And this is what we ended up with. So what you see here is a distribution of each signature whistle category. So you have Luna, Neo, Nikita, Joseph, and Nana, and the non-signature whistles and their occurrence in the data set. Something that might jump to the eye right away is that there's a lot of signature whistles. Most of the data set is covered by signature whistles. We expected that, but it also begs the question of how is it possible that dolphins are maintaining this sophisticated society and are, having these sophisticated behaviors in foraging and in general keeping the cohesion of the pod by just calling each other by name, right? So this is the first part of our analysis. We're really trying to dig deeper into this question because traditionally, in dolphin literature, we've been looking at the whistle, at the signature whistle, as an atomic unit. We have never wondered if there might be something beyond the whistle. And obviously, we're all familiar with the problem of finding the unit in the dolphin communication system that we're looking at, right? So here's our take on why the whistle there might be more to a signature whistle than just the identity of the dolphin. So one of the things that we observed in our data set, here's another spectrogram, again, examples of Neo signature whistles, but this time in a sequence. What we observed is that these whistles, while they're very recognizable as Neo signature whistle because the shape overall remains quite stable, present quite a lot of variability in terms of frequency modulation, but also power of harmonics in our data set, stretch and compression, and their duration, and the way amplitude is also modulated. Maybe you can focus, for example, on the topmost part of the whistle and see that, well, this is sort of an invariable non-modulated whistle. They tend to play, Neo tends to play a lot with the top part of the whistle. So what is going on, right? We try to work through hypotheses. The first hypothesis that we want to work through and maybe discard is that this is just the result of a random process. So there might be some biophysical noise that is creating these modulations. And the way we work through these hypotheses is by trying and quantify where and how these modulations occur. And so here are two examples of whistles. Bear with me. So on the left here, you have Neo signature whistle, and on the right, we have Nikita signature whistle. So 2 examples of Neo where we were able to cluster into different groups by aligning all the whistles. So we took the whistles contour. And then we wanted to see if using a clustering algorithm, we were able to identify different groups that would be biologically meaningful, so that we could recognize as having different shapes and sort of confirm what we intuitively, qualitatively observe from the data. So what you see here is that we were actually able to group, these are just 2 examples, Neo signature whistle into 2 subcategories. From here on, I'm going to refer to them as subcategories. So Neo5 and Neo6 are all examples of the same signature whistle, but with very different shapes. So in the first one, you see that Neo is playing a lot with the topmost part. And what we did was we quantified these by measuring the deviation from a base model of each instance of a signature whistle. And we observed that there is a peak indeed where we see in the data that Neo plays a lot, so at the topmost part, and the rest of the whistle is not peaking at all. So the same goes for Nikita. This type of whistle tends to be, as opposed to the base model, to the base whistle, tends to be modulated a lot towards the end, right before the tail. And these we were able to quantify with a peak over here. I can give you more details about the analysis, but for time reasons, I'm not going to go into it. So the intuition is that if this was just the result of a random process, we would expect these peaks to occur a bit everywhere, right? We'd expect this to be uniform across the whistle, but we are actually able to group them into different subcategories. So let's exclude the random process and let's try to wonder if there might be more to this. So what about this variability being linked to the identity of the emitter? So we can think of it as sort of like an accent that every dolphin has. So a specific way that every individual has of pronouncing a signature whistle. So we went on and we labeled a subset of the data manually with emitter information. We did so by looking at some videos in which the dolphins were alone and saying their own signature whistle and another dolphin signature whistle. So what you see here, again, are 4 examples of clusters of Neo signature whistle, so 4 subcategories, and the color indicates the emitter of the whistle. So you have Neo in blue and Josefa in red. If the emitter was the end of the story, so it was enough to explain the variability that we observe, then we wouldn't expect the colors to be scattered all around the plots, right? We would expect just one plot to be the way Josefa says Neo and another plot to be the way that Neo says Neo. But we see that the emitters are, different emitters are producing different variations of the whistle. So we discard the second hypothesis as well, and we're left with the hypothesis that actually these variations might carry more information that go beyond the identity of the emitter. And this is our first conclusion. So we propose that we should not stop at the whistle as an atomic unit, but we should go and look at the sub-whistle level in order to test hypotheses of whether these units are bearing more meaning. And the idea is that dolphins might be using the signature whistle as something along the lines of a radio station, where the signature whistle contour is the carrier signal, and the way it's modulated and the way they play around with it is the way they convey information. And to sort of see if this hypothesis is valid, it's time to look at sequences of whistles. So we move on from the signature whistle as an atomic unit, and we consider all these subcategories. And then the idea is to try and look at sequences from our acoustic recordings. So obviously, first of all, we have to define a sequence. So what do we use a sequence here is, once again, we use these sub-units as the unit of the sequences we're going to look at, of which you see, again, some examples here, Neo, Luna, and Nikita, and you can see how different shapes, we were able to cluster different shapes in different groups. And in order to define what a sequence is, that is also non-trivial, we use the bottom-up approach, so a data-based approach, and we modeled the inter-whistle time interval. We checked it against a null model, and we took the point in which our data, in blue, intersected the null model, and this was at around 6 seconds. So any whistle that is divided by less than 6 seconds from the next whistle is going to be considered as part of a sequence. Everything above it is standalone whistle. So let's look at it. What we did to visualize this patterns in sequences was using a Markov chain model to look at the probabilities of transitions between these subunits. So what you see here is a network built from the Markov chain model, and every color represents a signature whistle type. Every node is a sub whistle type, so a subcategory. From here on, I'm going to refer to as nodes. And the arrows between nodes represent the transition probability between one node and the next. And here we only kept statistically significant probabilities of transition that we checked against a null model. Yes, so you see some examples of the categories that we're using. The first thing that pops to the eye is that we didn't necessarily expect this network to be clustered, right? But you see that all the signature whistles of Neo are clustered together. So are the signature whistles of Luna in blue. This means that these whistles actually are produced in sequences. So the same main category, for example, Neo, will be followed by many examples of the same main category, but having different subcategories. Why is this interesting? Because it gives us yet another hint that dolphins are indeed using sequences. And something else that we can observe is that the cluster of Luna and Neo are, the cluster of Luna and Nikita are very close to each other. And we have this information from the trainers that the two dolphins are actually hanging out a lot. So they're spending a lot of time together. And this made us think that maybe we can actually infer some social information about the pod by just looking at the acoustic recordings. So how did we do that? Oops. This is, just to make that point again, we see that the clusters of Luna and Neo are very compact. We have a cluster of non-signature whistles that we call NSW from here on, and I repeat that just in case, it's whistles that we don't know the function of. We have quite a few in our data set, but we don't know their function. And there is an interesting cluster of just those. So when they're produced in sequences. And what we observe here is that Luna and Neo, so blue and green, only appear in their own cluster. So why is that interesting? I'll tell you in a second. While other colors appear a bit scattered all over the place. So the idea here is to try and infer some information about the pod social structure, just looking at this, how these nodes behave. And in order to do this, we looked at some measures of this network. So what you see here is on the x-axis, every bar is a node, and so a subcategory colored according to the dolphin. And on the y-axis, you have the probability of a given node to be followed by a node of the same main category. So for a green node to be followed by another green node. Something that we noticed is that both Luna and Neo have all probabilities beyond lower than the chance threshold. So that means that Luna and Neo tend to produce a lot of monologues. So once Neo and Luna start talking, they will just have a higher probability of keep producing their own name, and so a lower probability of changing category. And the fact that they are producing monologues make us think of something that we also learned from the trainers. So that Neo is the only male, and males tend to have a dominant role in pods. And Luna is one of the oldest members of the pod. So she also, we know from the trainers, has a bit of a leading role. So we can imagine these dolphins going around and talking a lot, because they're the two individuals that give us most of the data, and sort of making monologues. And as opposed to that, we have Josefa, who is the dolphin, the spotted dolphin that joined the group for just a small amount of time, who is showing quite the opposite pattern. So she tends to just respond, or her whistles are found in the middle of sequences of other whistles, right? So these hints to the fact that Josefa is mainly responding or trying to communicate, but no one is listening to her. So she's trying to integrate into the pod, not successfully. This is also another piece of information that we have from the trainers over there that she eventually was not really able to integrate in the pod. But we also looked at two more strictly network measures. So the first one is strength, which is a measure that just tells us how central a specific node is to the network. So how frequently it's used, and we call them hubs. And betweenness, or betweenness centrality, which captures which nodes are working as bridges. So how important this node is to keep the flow of communication in the network. So let's look at these some of these results. So we see that, for example, Luna and Neo both have peaks in their nodes, meaning that there are specific nodes that are hubs. So they're very central to the network, but they have very low betweenness. So nodes that have high strength and low betweenness, we refer as hubs. While Nikita, in red, is showing quite the opposite pattern. So she has some nodes that have very low strength, and we know that socially she's not dominant at all. She's quite low in the hierarchical social structure, but she hangs out a bit with everyone. And one of the categories we see having very high betweenness, meaning Nikita is probably very important for keeping the cohesion of the pod with their communication. And we also look here at the correlation between these two measures that I just told you, so strength and betweenness. And the point here is that even if we can see that most of the nodes have correlated levels of low strength and low betweenness, so the bottom left part, there are nodes that show low strength and high betweenness, or high strength and high betweenness. Why is this interesting? So this hints to the fact that subcategories, the subcategories that we're using, actually have different roles, different communication roles. So a hypothesis that we advance is that hubs might work along the lines of messages that don't expect a reply, sort of like orders, while what Nikita says, so nodes that have really high betweenness but low strength might function as messages, so messages that have to be carried around in the pod and that the dolphins can reply to. So that's the second conclusion. So we can really draw some conclusions about the social life of the pod and the roles that different dolphins have in the pod by simply looking at the vocalization network. So once again, all we're doing is we're passively recording their vocalizations, and we built a network from that. And the idea is that, first of all, we were able to label some individuals as leaders or non-leaders just based on what they're saying and the probability of them saying it. And that specific nodes, so the subcategories that I told you about, might indeed serve specific communication functions. And so this is not only important in terms of ecology, of how we can gather data passively and still be able to draw some conclusions about the pod social structure, but also towards the idea that using subcategories and going beyond the whistle as an atomic unit is really important and can uncover new ideas in the way they communicate. But that's not it for the Markov model, because I've only been talking about non-signature whistles for now. Sorry, about signature whistles, and we've been ignoring a little bit non-signature whistles, but we actually found something really interesting. So when looking at the network, we noticed that some specific non-signature whistles were placed right in between these two clusters. And these are the clusters of Luna and Neo, who are siblings. This is the family tree of the dolphins that we have access to. And then another type of signature whistle, which is in pink, this one, was found really close to the cluster of Nana. So we went on and we checked what are these whistles? Might these whistles be actually signature whistles of dolphins that were in the dolphin reef before. So we checked them all against the contours, so the previously annotated signature whistles, using dynamic time warping alignment to quantify the difference. So you see here all the distances between the two non-signature whistles that we saw, tac, tac, and every other dolphins that was ever in the dolphin reef. So the lower the measure here, the better. And we actually found that the lowest distance by far was on one hand for the purple non-signature whistle with Dana, and Dana is the mother of Luna and Neo. So the node seems to be really placed between the two offsprings. And for Shai, who is the mother of Nana, once again, the node is placed right inside the cluster. So this means the dolphins are producing the signature whistles of the dead mothers. And who is producing the signature whistle of the dead mothers? The offsprings, right? So that's really interesting for us, because if we pause for a second and we try to think about what it is that we're looking for, what are we trying to do with dolphin communication? Well, we're trying to draw analogies and maybe find some of the features that our own communication system has, without imposing, but just using the tools that linguistics provides. We can actually say a few things about what we just talked about. And for talking about these, I need to introduce a couple of concepts. So the first one is that in human language, we are able to talk about things that are not there in space and time, and this is called displacement. And this is quite useful and special. We're also able to refer to specific instances of objects or individuals. Names are a good example. And there is an arbitrariness between the sound or the means of communication and the referent. So the word whale, it's a very small word, but it refers to a huge thing. So there is no relation between the air that I'm moving with my mouth when I say whale and the animal out there in the world. And dolphins, I will argue, show all three of these features. So I just said that dolphins in our pod have been talking about their dead mothers, or at least they're using the dead mothers' names. So they're able, at the very least, to refer to something that is not there anymore. In this case, a deceased animal. So this is an example of displacement. Referential use is the very definition of a signature whistle. So the fact that they have names for each other. Not only they can say their own names, but they can call each other. And arbitrariness, we observe in the fact that there is absolutely no relation between the sound that they're producing with their melon, with their hole, and the individual that they're talking about. And this is really interesting because there's not many animals in the world, or as far as we know, that show all three of these features. So let's draw some conclusions. We work with a data set that is quite unique. It's been collected in a way that allows us to follow the same pod of dolphins over a long period of time, and allows us to gather quite large amounts of data. The first result relates to the variability that we observed in the signature whistles, and the fact that they may encode further information that goes beyond the identity of the dolphin as it's been traditionally thought. The second result relates to the fact that we can use just acoustic recordings to draw conclusions about their social structure and the roles that different dolphins have in the pod. And that these subcategories that we inferred through the variability analysis might actually play different functional roles in their communication. Finally, what I just talked about, all of these things boil down to there might be some linguistic features or we can use linguistic tools to describe what is going on in dolphin acoustic communication, and whatever it is, it's very sophisticated. I want to conclude by also giving you a little glimpse about what I'm working on right now and the future work that this project is going to be focusing on. And the first thing is that the algorithm that we developed for extracting whistles was only focusing on the frequency contour, and we were kind of losing information about the spectrum, the rest of the spectrum. So what we did is we used the first batch of extracted whistles to do this automatically using a CNN. And importantly, we were able to not only get the data for only the 2019 data set that I presented my results on, but for the whole duration of the recordings that go from 2018 to right now, so 2024, for a total of 100 hours of just pure dolphin sounds, mainly whistling and some burst pulses, which in our data set are a bit more rare. So this is large for the baseline of dolphin databases that there is out there. So the second thing is we need some context, right? All of this has been done by just sort of blindly looking at what they're saying. And we really want to leverage the people down at Dolphin Reef and the information that they can give us in order to add some behavioral context and to put whatever sounds they're making in their specific context. So the divers and the trainers down at the Dolphin Reef are kind enough to share with us regularly logs of the dives that they do during the day. So they will go in the water and interact with the dolphins, and then they will come back and write down everything that the dolphins did right to the minute. This is very useful for them to keep track of everything, and is very useful for us. So we want to use NLP techniques to just extract information from this text in a scalable way. And what you see here is an example of this technique that allows us to see, for example, how many times in the data that we have, Nana in green got rubs, or how many times she was playing or fighting, or Luna was going around with her plastic bag. Finally, while this input from the divers is very consistent and has valuable information, we also want to integrate other information from our cameras. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have 4 cameras installed, static cameras. So this is interesting for us to enhance the data set with multimodal information. I'll show you just an example of the kind of data that we can get with the cameras at the moment. So that's a dolphin. And the cameras are covering a 360 degrees angle. Voila. And last but not least, I put quite a lot of focus on the existence of subunits in dolphin communication, but the way we infer them for the analysis required some heuristics on our side. So we might be bringing some bias in this. And we thought that we could leverage the large data set that we created, so over 100 hours, to pre-train a model, so a self-supervised model, where the idea is to infer these meaningful units automatically, like it has been successfully done for human speech. And this is quite a promising avenue. We're working on this right now. I'm happy to talk about it more if you're interested. And that is all for me. One last thing, sorry, I want to make a special mention to my colleague, Fadil, who is my PhD colleague, and we are doing all this work together, and just say thanks in general to the lab and to our collaborators.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I have actually 2 questions. So one is about the variability, the difference between style and content in the whistles themselves. Given that dolphins probably communicate at a certain distance in the medium, have you looked at what kind of changes disappear with distance? So what kind of information is lost, and from this infer basically at what distance is it intended that they communicate?
Right. So the data that you saw and that I presented today comes from only one hydrophone. So we are only able to do that right now that we have 3 hydrophones. And what we looked at was whether we could see these variations being present in all 3 hydrophones. And the answer is yes, but I can only give you a qualitative answer for now. We don't have a quantification of that yet. Just the intuition is exactly like trying to check what information is lost in or conserved across all 3 recording points so that we can get we can answer exactly this type of question. But for now, we don't have a quantification of that.
Maybe if I can have second question.
Sure.
Is you showed what happens when the dolphin associated with some whistle disappears, presumably died. What happens? Have observed situations when the opposite happens, when for example, a new dolphin appears or is born, and there is a new sound that is introduced.
So we have some examples of the whistle, the signature whistle being developed from the calf. I actually might have, yeah. So we have just one example of Nana when she was very little, so she was born. And she's the one who is producing the signature whistle of the deceased mother. What we have is the development of the signature whistle from just copying the mother's signature whistle into her own distinctive sound nowadays. But we haven't had any newborn in the last 4 or 5 years, which is when we started recording. The closest thing we have is Josefa coming in, so the spotted dolphin joining the pod, and Josefa producing her own sound, but also the other dolphins producing Josefa's sound. So this confirms the fact that other dolphins can call each other and imitate each other. I don't know if that answers the question.
Hi, Chiara, thanks, great talk. If I understand you correctly, you're proposing what I would call the Pokemon theory of dolphin communication. I presume you're familiar with Pokemons.
Yeah, but Pokemon say their name
They only say their own name,
yeah,
but they use prosody to communicate.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pikachu goes, Pikachu, 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 right?
Correct.
And but in this particular case, they are able to produce each other's vocalization.
Yes.
And so the question I have is, how much of your data set you have an idea of the identity of the meter of any given? Are you able to co-locate with the cameras or with the hydrophones? Or
right? So that's a very good question. Let's go in order. So yes, as I said, dolphins are able to say each other's signature whistle. I just show you quickly an example here where we have an example of the signature whistle of Neo, and then right after the signature whistle of Nikita. So this is one dolphin saying both things. We don't know the identity of the dolphin, but we know that at least one of them signature whistles is not the signature whistle of the owner, right? So in our data set, we don't have information about the emitter because we're unable to put hydrophones or recording devices directly on the dolphins. We can only passively monitor them. What we do is we assume that and what we observe also is that most of the time is the owner of the whistle that will say their own name, kind of like Pokemon. Most of the time, like Pikachu only says Pikachu, but then when Pikachu is called, there is also an instance of the same name being called, but it's from someone else. And these, the previous literature tells us happens. So the owner of the whistle producing their own whistle happens 50 to 70% of the time. So we can safely assume that 50 to 70% of the instances of signature whistles that we see are produced by the owner of the signature whistle.
That's remarkably lower percentage than I would have expected. So you're saying that literally half the time to a third of the time, other dolphins are calling them.
Yes.
That's quite.
It's quite a lot.
That's quite a lot.
And yeah, sorry.
Can you hear the same whistles in your different hydrophones? Is there any way you can triangulate that?
Yes. So
to at least know where the whistle was produced.
This is something that we're doing right now. So my colleague Fadil is working on triangulation, and his whole PhD project is about inferring individual specific features in order to classify emitters. And this is the reason why we place the 3 hydrophones in a triangle. The main technical challenge with that is that sound in water travels in a quite a different way that it does in air, and so triangulation becomes a bit challenging because we have to take into account the currents, and we're working on that. It's exactly the big elephant in the room, I would say, at the moment. We can talk about it.
Okay, a lot of questions. Okay.
Thanks. Is there information above bigrams, so longer range dependencies that you think are interesting?
So we tried to do that using the same Markov model approach, just a higher order Markov model. And yes, we just don't really have enough data at the moment. I hope to do that with the new data that we just extracted with the rest of the years. We had we used something else that is not a Markov model. We used the hypergraphs to model just the existence, the relations, not bigrams, so not like specifically in the same order, but just given a sequence of any length, how many times the same category would co-occur in a sequence. And we did that with higher order hypergraphs as well. We did find some significant associations, but the data was really low, let's say. So I can talk to you later if you want a little bit more about it. So more
do you see, so taking that modulated signal analogy further, can you see commonalities in the sorts of modulations across different signature whistles?
So yeah, that's the first thing, right, that one would think about. It's like, okay, if we can figure out all the dolphins change their signature whistle at the end, then there must be something. The answer is no. So we found that the modulations that we observed are very variable, even on a interdolphin basis. So Neo will always or almost always add something at the end and modulate the top, while Nikita tends to modulate just the bit before the tail. So it's no. Okay. For now, no.
And then maybe steal one tiny other question. Is
Sure.
there any, so I know other species, you'll have relationships between fundamental frequency and body size.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you observe that in the dolphins and can use that as a way to get at individual.
Right. So when you talk about fundamental frequency, so if we look at whistles, it's just one frequency.
Okay.
So there is just the fundamental frequency. There is just the whistle itself. And we, in the small data set that we labeled with the meter information, we weren't able to relate any acoustic feature directly, any, let's say, basic acoustic features like F0 or, well, there's mainly F0, honestly, or duration to an individual. But this might totally be just a lack of labeled data, because I would expect intuitively dolphins to have idiosyncratic acoustic features to be able to distinguish them based on their voice. It would make sense. We just need more data to look into that question. And yeah, this is what we're going to use triangulation for, right? We're going to try to get.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I was going to talk about some of the contours that you were showing and the animals' relationship, genetic relationship. Do you know you said you knew who was related? Do they have a pretty good sense of that? Because you talked about the mother, because in the literature, it's been really interesting, because it seems that males look like their male signature whistles look a lot like the mothers. Yeah. I think that's been shown pretty consistently. You showed that. Do you have that? You were showing that. The females, did you find that the females tended to look like the moms or not moms? Maybe I missed something that you said, because it seems to be a split and it's unclear, it's not well understood.
So the most straightforward example I have maybe is the one that I was showing of Nana. Mm-hmm. So Nana is one of the offsprings of Shai. And we have actually followed how her signature whistle developed from just imitating the mothers into becoming Nana's own signature whistle. And now they end up looking quite similar. And you can say, I guess you could argue the same about Lemon and Nemesh, who are unfortunately deceased. But they're males, right? So I don't see a straightforward relationship with the gender, with the sex. But then we have to agree on what we mean by similarity, right?
Yeah.
Because the whistles are, to me, they all look very different, but maybe to someone else, they could look all very similar. I don't know, was it proven somewhere in the literature that there was a relationship between a female offspring and the mother's signature whistle looking like each other?
I think in the literature, it can go either way. They found that females can look like the mothers sometimes. Originally, they thought the males looked like the moms, and the idea was maybe that would serve for reproductive isolation in some way, and that the females looked different than the mothers. But then many groups have shown that that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think Frisch had talked about the fact that in one case, the female offspring's whistle developed to look like an animal she wasn't even associated with much. So I think it's a really interesting area to look at these relationships. Yeah, so it's very promising to have a group that you can look at. We're looking at one too, so it would be fun to combine to talk about some of it.
Later.
Thank you so much. There'll be more chance to ask questions afterwards, but really appreciate that talk. Thank you.
Thank you.